The courtroom didn't start with order. It started with a thud. Clara Whitmore hit the polished floor hard, the impact jolting through her ribs. A carton box she had carried split open. A dozen so-called magic rocks scattered across the tiles, clattering like dice on a table. One rolled farther than the rest, spinning, wobbling, then cracking in half. Inside, there was no shimmer, no hidden crystal, just gray, cheap cement. Dust leaked out in a thin puff. The room held its breath for half a second. Oh no! Then came the sound. M-B-A-M-B. The judge's gavel struck, sharp as a gunshot. The brass nameplate in front of him rattled against wood, the engraved letters trembling. A microphone squealed, then cut. And then a voice, low, rasping, soaked in contempt. Fraud? Officer Miguel Martinez spat the word as if it were poison. You're the fraud, lady. Sit down before I make you. His eyes burned into Clara. His uniform gleamed, badge polished too brightly, like a shield against any accusation. He was 42, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who believed authority was a weapon, not a duty. He stood tall in the witness box, but his voice carried across the whole room like a fist. The clerk froze mid-scribble. A spectator gasped. The camera's red light on the wall flickered once, barely noticeable. Foreshadowing, silent, patient. Clara did not speak. She sat on the cold stone, hands bracing against the floor, chest rising and falling. Her silence wasn't surrender. It was restraint. Her eyes scanned the room with surgical calm, the clerk's hesitation, the prosecutor's smirk, the judge's restless shifting in his chair. She absorbed it all, like someone who had practiced patience as a weapon. A shard of the broken rock stopped at her palm. She picked it up, stared at the dull cement core. A fake. A lie. Yet the lie told more truth than Martinez realized. Martinez leaned closer, lowering his voice, though everyone around could still hear the venom. People like me don't lose, he said, lips curling. Not in this town. His tone was a whisper sharpened into a knife. It was more dangerous than the shout before, because it carried confidence. The confidence of a man who believed the system was built to protect him. A slow heartbeat began to pulse in Clara's ears. Not her imagination, her body reminding her she was still human, still fragile. Thump, 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 thump. D. Louder. Louder. It filled the silence until it was almost another soundtrack in the courtroom. She forced her breathing steady, eyes unblinking. She didn't flinch at his threat. She didn't break. But the audience watching the story unfold would, because the heartbeat belonged to them now, echoing in their own chests. The bailiff hesitated, unsure whether to intervene. The judge lifted his gavel again, but it hovered mid-air, as though even he wasn't certain what side he was on. The prosecutor leaned back, smiling faintly, enjoying the humiliation. Martinez spread his hands theatrically, turning toward the gallery. Ladies and gentlemen, he barked, you're looking at a scam artist. She buys junk online, pretends they're evidence, and tries to ruin good men like me. I've served this community 20 years. 20 years. And this? He kicked one of the rocks with his boot, sending it skidding under a bench. This is her proof? Laughter broke out from two men in the back row. A cough tried to hide another chuckle. The balance of sympathy tilted, just as Martinez wanted. He was not merely defending himself. He was staging theater. Clara rose slowly, brushing dust from her skirt. Her lips remained sealed, but her eyes locked on him. There was fire there, not rage but clarity. A kind that didn't shout. The gavel struck again. Order, the presiding judge muttered, though his voice carried no weight. The rocks lay scattered still, dull gray against polished wood, as if mocking the very idea of magic. Clara bent down, picked up one fragment, and set it gently on the table before her. The audience might think she was still shaken. But the camera? Oh, the camera caught the flicker in her gaze, the foreshadowing in the tightening of her jaw. Inside, she was already thinking 3 moves ahead, already counting the cracks in Martinez's armor, already planning the moment when silence would turn into thunder. But for now, She let him believe he had won. Martinez smirked. He thought her quiet was fear. He thought the broken rock was defeat. He didn't notice that the heartbeat sound, hers, his, the audience's, was syncing with the camera's red light on the wall. A rhythm. A countdown. The courtroom was no longer silent. It was Martinez's stage now. He straightened his uniform as though polishing his authority with the simple gesture. Then he turned toward the jury box, chest broad, chin lifted, voice rehearsed. "I've kept this town safe for 20 years, he declared, one hand striking the wood of the witness stand for emphasis. 20 years. I've stood between families and criminals, between chaos and order. And now?" He jabbed a finger toward Clara. "Now someone like her tries to smear me. For what? For profit. For attention. For whatever sick reason she tells herself when she looks in the mirror." The prosecutor smirked, leaning back in his chair, as if enjoying theater more than trial. Two uniformed officers seated near the aisle nodded along, affirmations of loyalty rather than evidence. Their synchronized gestures spoke louder than words. The system was closing ranks around its own. "She lies," Martinez said, his tone sharp. Then again, louder. "She lies." He paused, let the echo settle, then slammed his palm down once more. "She lies." The rhythm reverberated through the room like a chant, a sermon designed to hypnotize the audience. Heads in the gallery bobbed unconsciously, following the cadence. It was less testimony than performance brainwashing packaged in patriotic soundbites. Clara sat perfectly still. She had returned to her seat, her hands folded, her face unreadable. But her eyes, they never blinked, never strayed. They followed Martinez like a surgeon's scalpel follows a vein. Calm, controlled, cutting without motion. The clerk, Daniel, shifted in his chair. His pen hovered mid-air, ink dripping a tiny blot onto the ledger. He wanted to write something down, to capture the unease gnawing at him, but fear pressed his hand into stillness. He was only 25, too new to this system, too afraid of breaking ranks. So he swallowed the lump in his throat and kept his silence. Martinez saw none of that hesitation. It was too busy performing. He reached behind him, pulled a thin folder, and slapped it open on the stand. "Here," he said, lifting a stack of documents for all to see. "Proof of my integrity. Transaction records that show exactly how she tried to entrap me." The prosecutor leaned forward. "Let's submit those into evidence, Your Honor." The judge nodded distractedly. "So admitted." Pages fluttered in Martinez's hands like confetti. He held them up high, then pinned one against his chest. And then, as if the stage needed more drama, he turned toward the American flag standing at the corner of the courtroom. His right hand pressed against his heart. "I swore to defend this flag," he boomed, voice trembling with artificial fervor. "And I have never broken that oath. Not once. This town knows it. This court should know it. I bleed for this country, not for lies." The gallery erupted in small applause before the bailiff hushed them. It didn't matter. The effect had landed. Even those who had doubted now saw a soldier of the law pledging allegiance to the symbol everyone revered. Clara tilted her head just slightly, not in disbelief but in recognition. She'd seen this tactic before, wrapping fraud in patriotism, hiding corruption behind a flag. She didn't move, but a flicker of disappointment crossed her face, too quick for most to notice. Then, unexpectedly, a man in the gallery stood. He was thin, with calloused hands and weary eyes. "That's not true," he blurted. "I saw the exchange." "She didn't." The prosecutor shot to his feet. "Whitley. Objection. Irrelevant. Sit down." The judge banged his gavel once, weakly. "Sit down. That testimony is not admitted." The man's protest died in his throat. He lowered his head, sank back into the bench. Around him, people hissed for silence, some glaring as if he were the disruptor rather than the truth-teller. The machine had swallowed his courage whole. Martinez smirked. "See? Even the court agrees. There's no room for lies here." He returned to his folder, lifting one sheet higher than the rest. "Here's the record of her so-called purchase. Look at the date. Look at the amount. She staged it. She wired money to herself, then blamed me. A few jurors leaned forward. The paper seemed convincing, the kind of dry document no ordinary person would dare question. Numbers and dates, the illusion of truth. But Clara's gaze sharpened. One detail had glimmered out of place. The date. The same day, Martinez claimed to be on patrol in another county. Too neat. Too impossible. He said nothing, not yet. Her silence wasn't surrender. It was a trap, left open for him to step deeper into. Martinez sensed victory. His voice swelled, confidence thickening with every word. People like her exploit the system, he thundered. They cry fraud. They scream injustice, and the rest of us, the men who wear the badge, pay the price. She doesn't want justice. She wants fame. She wants headlines. He shook the folder again, paper edges slicing the air. This is her script, and I won't let her write me as the villain. He slapped the folder shut, the crack echoing like a gunshot. Lies. She lies. She lies. The chant rolled again, 3 beats, louder each time, until the words seemed to vibrate in the chest of everyone listening. Daniel the clerk squeezed his pen tight. He wanted to shout that the dates didn't line up, that something felt wrong, but his throat closed. He was a clerk, not a soldier. His role was to record, not resist. So he lowered his eyes and wrote down the words as instructed. She lies. The prosecutor leaned back once more, satisfied. The judge's expression was unreadable. And Clara? She hadn't moved an inch. Inside, though, her mind was already slicing through the lies like a scalpel. The documents were flawed. Martinez thought he had buried her under noise, but he had merely laid the bricks of his own downfall. Her silence lingered, and that silence unsettled him. He turned back, sneering. "Cat got your tongue, lady?" he asked, trying to provoke. "Or maybe you're afraid the truth is finally catching up." Clara only blinked. Slow, deliberate. Then she leaned slightly forward, her voice low enough that only those closest heard. Truth doesn't shout. It waits. Martinez froze for half a breath, then scoffed, covering his unease with another smirk. More riddles. That's all she has. Quote N. The jury shifted uneasily. The rhythm of his chant had worked, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Somewhere in those pages, in those mismatched dates, in that silenced witness, something was off. And Clara knew seeds of doubt, once planted, always grow. The gavel struck again. "Proceed," the judge muttered. The act was over for now, but the lie had already begun to unravel. The courtroom had been saturated with noise. Martinez's shouts, the prosecutor's laughter, the chant of, "She lies." But when Clara Whitmore stood, silence arrived like a sudden storm. She didn't slam her hands. She didn't shout. She simply rose. One deliberate movement, the hem of her blazer brushing against her knees. "Your Honor," she said, voice calm, steady. The microphone caught every syllable and released it in perfect clarity. According to Section 1340 of Title 18, fraud through wire and online platforms is a federal crime. I request a preservation order for the transaction records. The words fell like measured stones into a still pond. No flourish, no drama, just law. The gallery shifted uncomfortably. For the first time since Martinez had taken control, people were listening, really listening. Martinez scoffed, his face reddening. "Preservation order? She doesn't even." But Clara wasn't addressing him. She spoke to the court, to the record, to the system itself. Federal statute is clear. Wire fraud carries up to 20 years in prison. When online transactions cross state lines, the jurisdiction is federal. That includes the sale of counterfeit goods marketed as supernatural artifacts. The prosecutor leaned forward, suddenly less amused. The words weren't wild accusations, they were precise, sharpened by knowledge no ordinary victim should have. Martinez slammed his hand against the railing. "It's ridiculous. She's quoting laws she doesn't understand. She's not a lawyer." Clara turned her head, just enough to glance at him. Her eyes were unflinching. "Officer, I'm quoting directly from the United States Code. Every word is on public record." She began again, slower this time, deliberate, as if engraving each syllable into the walls. Section 13:43. Title: 18. The microphone carried her cadence, each word a drumbeat. The earlier chant of "Shay, lies ka" had been Martinez's weapon. Now the echo of statute was hers. The camera in the corner caught faces in sequence. The prosecutor's smirk faltering, one juror's brow furrowing, the clerk Daniel straightening in his seat, his pen suddenly moving again, capturing every word. Clara placed both hands lightly on the table. This court should not dismiss evidence without proper examination. Therefore, I request an immediate preservation order for all digital and financial records tied to the defendant's online sales. That includes bank transfers, shipment tracking, and email correspondence. A ripple moved through the room. This wasn't the desperate plea of a victim. This was the precise motion of someone who knew the system inside out. Martinez leaned forward, veins bulging at his temple. Feeling like she's grandstanding. None of this is relevant. Clara cut in, her voice still calm, her tone almost surgical. Officer Martinez, under oath, do you swear this transaction log is true? The room froze. His mouth opened, then shut. A flicker small but undeniable crossed his face. For the first time, hesitation. The jury saw it. The gallery saw it. Clara saw it. Her eyes narrowed just slightly, enough to show she had found the crack. Answer the question, she said, softer now, but sharper. Martinez coughed, shifting in his seat. Of course it's true. His voice lacked the thunder it had carried moments before. Then you won't object to a preservation order verifying it, Clara replied, her words slicing with precision. The judge shifted uneasily, tapping his gavel but not striking. We will take that under advisement. The tension in the room thickened. The chant of "she lies" seemed suddenly fragile, like glass ready to shatter. Clara let the silence breathe for a moment, then continued. Not to Martinez, not to the prosecutor, but to the room itself. Fraud is not always loud, she said, voice carrying. It doesn't arrive with flashing lights or gunshots. It comes in quiet invoices, in clever wording, in false promises wrapped in patriotic gestures. It thrives on silence, on the hope that no one will ask the right question at the right time. The gallery leaned forward, caught in her rhythm. She paused, drawing a slow breath. Her mind flickered back to a memory. A friend, years ago, who had poured her savings into an investment scheme. Clara had warned her, but the system hadn't. When it collapsed, the friend lost everything. Money, home, dignity. Clara had stood by helplessly, silent, watching trust turn to ash. That silence had haunted her. That silence was why she fought now. She returned to the present, voice steady. I once watched someone I cared about lose everything to a lie. I said nothing then. I won't repeat that mistake. Martinez's fists clenched, his face red, his body language screaming rage. She's making herself a saint in front of the jury. Clara didn't flinch. I don't need sainthood. I need truth. The words landed heavier than any accusation. She straightened her papers, deliberately calm. The microphone caught even the soft brush of paper against wood. Truth doesn't shout, she said, each word deliberate. It waits. The line hung in the air like smoke, refusing to disperse. Daniel, the clerk, stopped writing for a second, his pen frozen above the page. He looked at Clara as though seeing her for the first time, not as a victim, but as something more. Kilo, whispered. Jurors shifted. Even the prosecutor stopped smirking. Martinez, however, erupted. You think you can outsmart me? I've served this country for decades. I bleed blue. You're nothing but a fraud. He was red, shaking, his voice cracking with fury. His control, the control he had brandished so confidently, was slipping. And against that chaos, Clara stood in perfect stillness, her voice calm, her expression unreadable. The contrast was blinding. One man raging, spitting, drowning in his own noise. One woman anchored, deliberate, her words sharp as steel. She gathered her papers, tapped them neatly, then looked up at the bench. This court will hear more evidence soon, she said. But let the record reflect. I have spoken under the weight of my judicial oath. The phrase fell heavy. Judicial oath. It was subtle, almost casual, but the room stiffened. The questions hung in the air. Judicial oath? Who exactly was this woman? Clara gave no answer. She simply sat back down, hands folded once more, eyes calm, as if nothing extraordinary had been said at all. But the silence that followed told a different story. The courtroom was no longer Martinez's stage. It was hers. The courtroom had not breathed for several seconds. Every face was turned toward Clara Whitmore, waiting for her next word, waiting to see if her calm persistence would survive Martinez's storm. Then she reached into her case file, not for another stack of papers, not for another motion, but for something small, leather-bound, edged with gold. A card. She laid it on the table for a second, then lifted it high enough for the judge, the prosecutor, the jury, and even the farthest gallery bench to see. The seal of the United States Judiciary gleamed under the fluorescent lights. "Appointment," she said simply, her voice carrying. "Federal Judge, Eastern District of New York." The room collapsed into silence so absolute it had weight. Clerk Daniel's pen slipped from his fingers and rolled across the desk before clattering to the floor. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the stillness. Martinez blinked, his mouth opening but no words escaping. The prosecutor's jaw actually dropped. The judge on the bench froze, hand tightening on the gavel as if it had suddenly become too heavy to lift. Clara rose, one motion as deliberate as before, but now she reached for the garment folded neatly in her briefcase. She lifted it out with slow precision. A robe. Black fabric, heavy, its trim lined with subtle gold thread. She held it for a moment, staring at it. The weight of memory pressed against her chest. Years of cases, years of silence, years of letting others speak while she waited. Inside her mind, a thought pulsed. I've stayed silent long enough. Time to sit in my rightful chair. She slid one arm in, then the other. Slow motion. The fabric unfurled, catching the cold light of the ceiling. The gold trim shimmered, not like jewelry, not like vanity, but like responsibility made visible. And then? Another silence. Not hers this time. The air conditioning cut off mid-cycle. The faint hum that had underscored the entire trial stopped. For a moment, it felt as if the very room had decided to hold its breath. A whisper rose from the back, fragile but clear. "She's the judge." The words spread like sparks on dry grass. Another voice repeated, louder. "She's the judge." Then another, then another. A wave of realization rolled through the gallery, through the jury box, through the officers sitting stiff-backed on the benches. Dominoes falling. Martinez shook his head furiously, his voice finally returning. "No. This is some kind of stunt. It can't. She's lying." But the chant wasn't his anymore. The whisper that had once been, "She lies," was gone. Now, the whisper belonged to her truth. Clara straightened, the robe heavy across her shoulders. She looked neither triumphant nor arrogant. She looked burdened, as though the cloth itself weighed more than lead. Inside her, another thought surfaced. The robe isn't power. It's burden. And I'm ready to carry it. Her gaze swept the room. Daniel, wide-eyed, stared at her as though history had just unfolded before him. The prosecutor's smirk was gone, replaced with sweat on his brow. The presiding judge swallowed hard, then leaned back as if he suddenly realized the bench he sat on might not be his to command. Clara stepped forward, the sound of her heels measured against the marble floor. Each step a verdict in itself. Martinez stumbled back half a pace. His broad shoulders seemed to shrink under the realization. A man who moments earlier had been thundering about loyalty, about patriotism, about 20 years of service, now reduced to sputtering disbelief. "You can't. You. This isn't." His words collapsed, fragments of protest falling apart before they left his tongue. Clara stopped at the center, the robe draping fully now, her badge of appointment displayed against her chest. "Officer Martinez," she said, her voice steady as stone. "For the last half-hour you spoke as though you were untouchable. As though this courtroom was your stage." as though truth was noise you could drown. That illusion ends here. Her words carried more force than any gavel. The gallery erupted, not in applause, not in cheers, but in a collective intake of breath, as though everyone had just seen the world tilt on its axis. Martinez tried to recover, tried to summon the authority that had always shielded him. You can't preside. You're. But his voice cracked again. Clara didn't need to answer. The robe answered for her. The appointment card answered for her. The silence of the judge who had lost his authority answered for her. Daniel bent, picked up his pen, but his hand shook so much he could barely hold it. He wrote only 2 words on his ledger. She's judge. The prosecutor shifted in his chair, finally realizing this was no ordinary trial, no ordinary witness. His earlier smirk curdled into dread. Clara turned her head slightly, scanning the jury. Some stared in awe, others in confusion, but all of them now knew one thing. The woman they had dismissed as a victim was something far greater. She breathed in, slow. This robe does not grant me victory. It does not shield me from failure. It burdens me with responsibility. I will carry it. Because truth deserves more than silence. Her eyes returned to Martinez. And you will answer for every lie you've spoken here. Martinez's face drained of color. His chest rose and fell rapidly. For the first time he looked small, trapped. The power in the room had shifted so completely it was almost visible, like a current changing direction. Clara no longer looked like someone defending herself. She looked like someone standing exactly where she belonged. The gallery whispered again, louder this time, reverent. Judge Whitmore. Judge Whitmore. And Martinez? He sat down, not because he wanted to, but because his legs no longer carried the weight of his own arrogance. The balance had reversed. The accuser had become the accused. The victim had revealed herself as the arbiter. The courtroom was no longer his theater. It was hers. The robe weighed heavy on Clara's shoulders, but her voice carried without tremor. She turned toward the bench, the jury, the gallery. Every corner of the room that had been drowning in lies minutes earlier. Your Honor, she said evenly, I move to admit video evidence. Exhibit A. The bailiff retrieved a small flash drive, slid it into the court monitor. A few seconds of static, then the screen blinked alive. The gallery leaned forward. The video came from a corner security camera, a dimly lit storage room, shelves stacked with boxes. Officer Martinez stood in the frame, uniform loosened, hand extended. A man shoved a wad of cash into it. Martinez tucked the bills into his jacket pocket. His voice filled the courtroom, strict of the thunder he'd used in testimony. The recording carried a careless swagger. These rocks? Just painted gravel. Easy money. The words cut sharper than any cross-examination. The gallery gasped, a chorus of disbelief rising like a tide. Jurors leaned forward instinctively, eyes locked on the screen. Martinez shifted in his seat, sweat blooming at his temple. His earlier smirk was gone, his jaw clenched so tight it seemed to ache. Clara's expression remained calm. Exhibit A demonstrates the defendant's acknowledgement of fraud in his own words. The prosecutor tried to recover. That video could be taken out of context. Context? Clara's voice snapped cold. The only context here is crime. He admits the rocks are fake. He admits the scheme is for easy money. That isn't misinterpretation. That is confession. The judge swallowed, nodding reluctantly. Hold it, A admitted. Clara gave a single nod, then pivoted smoothly. Exhibit B. The screen shifted. Now it showed a screenshot of an email chain, Martinez corresponding with 2 associates. The subject line, bulk shipment. Paint mix variation. The text scrolled across for all to read. Will coat the gravel with metallic spray. Looks mystical enough. Buyers won't know the difference. Easy markup. M. The gallery erupted again, shocked murmurs filling the chamber. Clara raised her hand, and the noise fell into silence, as though even the spectators recognized who truly commanded the room now. Exhibit B demonstrates deliberate intent to deceive buyers, Clara explained. This was no accident. This was a business model built on lies. Martinez slammed the desk with his fist. Uttered. Anyone could type those. Farah did not even flinch. She reached into her briefcase, pulled a thick sheaf of printed pages, and threw them onto the evidence table. The sound cracked like thunder, paper scattering across the wood. Bank transaction logs, she said. Her voice was iron. Straight from subpoenaed financial records. Pages fanned out, numbers glaring under the fluorescent lights. Transfers from dozens of accounts, withdrawals in cash, deposits traced directly to Martinez's personal savings. The gallery stilled, jaws slack, as Clara spoke over the paper storm. These logs are stamped, verified, and cross-checked. The dates match the so-called purchases. The amounts match the cash in his pocket. These are not forged. They are the truth in black and white. Martinez's face turned crimson. He shot up from his seat shouting, "Those are fake." Clara's eyes snapped toward him, her voice slicing colder than winter. "Q, so were your rocks?" The room exploded with gasps. A reporter scribbled furiously in the back row, already imagining tomorrow's headline. "So were your rocks." Martinez froze mid-protest, words caught in his throat. For the first time, his noise had no echo. Clara adjusted the robe at her shoulders, then spoke again, voice steady, commanding. "Exhibit C." The screen flickered once more. Body cam footage, grainy but clear. Martinez walking down a hallway, speaking casually into his shoulder mic. "Don't worry about complaints. Nobody checks them. As long as you keep your badge shiny, you can sell anything. Easy money." Another wave of murmurs surged. Jurors looked at one another, whispers exchanged without words. Clara turned toward the jury box. 47 complaints filed against this officer. 12 involving excessive force. All ignored, all buried. She stepped closer, her voice softening, no longer legal argument but something heavier. Numbers aren't data. It are lives stolen. 47 human beings silenced. 12 bodies bruised, and everyone dismissed because someone like him wore a badge. Her words hung in the air. Some in the gallery bowed their heads. A woman dabbed her eyes with a tissue. Martinez tried to muster a retort, but his voice cracked. It's coincidence. Statistics mean nothing." "Statistics," Clara cut in, "mean patterns. Patterns mean truth." She snapped her fingers. Montage rolled again. 1 complaint. 2, 3, names scrolling across the screen like tombstones. Each entry a silent accusation. Each line a reminder that his crimes weren't singular. They were systemic. Daniel, the clerk, scribbled furiously now, his earlier hesitation gone. His pen underlined the numbers as though he could carve them into permanence. The prosecutor shifted, eyes downcast, unwilling to meet the jury's gaze. He no longer looked like an ally to Martinez. He looked like a man wishing he had chosen another case. Clara let the silence linger, then gathered the scattered bank logs into a neat stack. She placed them gently on the evidence table, her movements precise, controlled. "This," she said, tapping the pile, "is not a victim's imagination. It is proof. Layer upon layer, each piece knocking down the lie he built." Martinez sank lower in his chair. His hands trembled visibly now, betraying the fear he had tried so hard to hide. Clara turned toward the judge's bench. "Your Honor, the evidence speaks louder than any testimony." He admitted it on camera. He wrote it in emails. He buried the complaints. Fraud is not a question anymore. It is fact. She turned back to the gallery, her voice carrying not just authority but conviction. The only question left is whether this court has the courage to face that fact. The room erupted again, not in applause, but in a collective, uncontainable murmur. It felt like history unfolding in real time, like the walls themselves were bearing witness. Martinez, once thunderous, once unshakable, now sat pale, sweat dripping down his temple. His lips moved, forming protests that never fully left his mouth. Clara's eyes narrowed. She had no need to gloat, no need to raise her voice. The robe spoke for her. The evidence spoke for her. Truth had waited, and now it thundered louder than any lie. Exhibits A, B, and C, she said finally, her voice calm as a verdict, are entered into record. And the courtroom knew, Hugh, the lies had been shattered. The evidence lay across the table in scattered sheets and glowing screens, undeniable and heavy. Martinez sat slumped, his arrogance cracked into fragments no chant could piece together. But Clara Whitmore did not stop. She adjusted the robe across her shoulders, exhaled once, and lifted her gaze to the jury. "Up to now," she said softly, "we've spoken about one man, one scheme, one fraud. But this?" She gestured to the piles of complaints, to the logs, to the video still frozen on the monitor. Martinez's face caught mid-smirk. "This is not a single fraud. This is a design." The word echoed. Design. Her tone shifted. She was no longer the lone voice of a victim reclaiming truth. Her voice carried the weight of a community. I had dissolved into we. "This isn't negligence," she continued. "It's design. And designs can be dismantled." The camera light on the wall blinked red, as if recording not only the trial but history itself. She raised one sheet and held it to the gallery. 47 complaints against this officer. Excessive force. Misconduct. Fraud. 47 voices. Ignored. The projector blinked, letters appearing across the courtroom screen in stark white text, like a slide on a PowerPoint no one could dismiss. The words hovered, plain and merciless. Clara lowered the sheet, lifted another. 12 cases of documented force. 12 times men and women left bruised, broken, silenced. Each one buried. Each one dismissed as if it never mattered. The next slide appeared. 2.3 M taxpayer money in settlements. She let the figure hang, the silence pressing harder than any gavel. $2.3 million. That's not just ink on paper. That's your money. That's schools unfunded. Roads unrepaired. Families betrayed. A low murmur rippled through the gallery. Ordinary citizens began to feel it. The fraud wasn't abstract anymore. It was their wallets, their streets, their children's classrooms. And still, Clara said, voice sharpening, this department faced no overhaul. No accountability. Until now. She stepped closer to the screen. Another slide appeared. DOJ consent decree pending. Clara faced the gallery. The Department of Justice. Civil Rights Division has investigated police departments across this country. When misconduct is systemic, when corruption is baked into the very rules, the DOJ imposes a consent decree, a mandate, a federal order to rip out the rot and rebuild from the ground up. This department is next. This case is not the end. It is the beginning. The gallery stirred louder, whispers swelling into voices. A reporter whispered into her recorder. Jurors leaned forward, brows furrowed. But Clara didn't stop at numbers. She knew statistics alone numbed the soul. She knew stories cut deeper. The screen flickered again, not a chart this time, a photograph. A woman in her 40s, hair pulled back, clutching a frame. The frame contained the smiling face of her teenage son. Clara's voice softened. This is Mrs. Alvarez. Her son, 16, was stopped on his way home from school. He never came back. The complaint she filed was buried under a stack of papers, ignored, forgotten, until today. Gasps spread across the gallery. Some covered their mouths. The photo lingered, raw and unforgiving. The image cut again. Now a young man, no older than 25, stood holding a folder. The folder was worn, stuffed with legal documents. Clara narrated, "This is David Gwynn. He spent 3 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Why? Because the same officer who sold painted gravel also falsified his arrest report. David begged for review. He filed appeals. Each one denied. Until today." The young man's eyes in the photo looked directly into the lens, unflinching. The gallery murmured again, but this time it wasn't shock. It was anger. Clara turned from the screen back to the room. Her eyes swept across jurors, across citizens, across Martinez's pale face. This courtroom is not a stage for one case. It's a mirror for a nation. The words fell like a hammer, harder than any gavel strike. She paced slowly, letting the weight of silence fill in the gaps. We want to believe fraud is an exception. That abuse is the failure of one man. But 47 complaints ignored? Millions in hush money paid? Mothers burying sons? Young men losing years to false charges? Her voice rose now, not with fury, but with certainty. Clear. That is design. And designs can be dismantled. The gallery erupted, not in chaos, but in a restless hum of agreement, of recognition. Clara's gaze sharpened. She spoke now not just to the courtroom, but to the camera's red eye, to the invisible audience beyond these walls. We cannot excuse silence anymore. We cannot excuse the shrug of, "That's how it works," because silence does not keep us safe. Silence feeds the lie, and every lie feeds the system that lets men like him profit, abuse, and bury the truth. Her hand gestured toward Martinez, who sat frozen, a ghost of the man who had once roared chants of, "Shh, she lies." Now, he was the one drowned in truth. She paused again. Her robe caught the light gold trim glinting. This isn't just about painted gravel. It's about painted trust. About a system polished to look whole while it rots beneath. The screen cut back to the infographic, all 3 lines in sequence now, stark white on black. SLU of 47 complaints ignored. Each 2.3 M taxpayer money in settlements. POS. DOJ consent decree pending. Clara's voice threaded through the text like a verdict. These aren't statistics. They are warning signs. They are cracks in the dam. And if we ignore them again, we drown. Daniel, the clerk, wrote the line in his ledger, underlining each word. The gallery had gone quiet again, but not in fear. In reverence. Clara closed the binder in front of her, hands steady, expression resolute. This trial isn't about whether one officer sold rocks. It's about whether a nation will keep pretending painted gravel is treasure, whether we will keep buying lies wrapped in uniforms, whether we will keep ignoring the cracks until the whole structure collapses. Her eyes returned to the jury, to the citizens, to the world beyond the lens. This isn't negligence. It's design, and designs can be dismantled. Silence followed, but it was the silence of realization, not suppression. And in that silence, the nation stared back at itself. The courtroom had become something more than a room. It was an altar of silence, waiting for one voice to name truth. Clara Whitmore stood at its center, robe heavy on her shoulders, her hand resting lightly on the bench before her. She did not rush. She let the silence stretch, because silence, finally, belonged to her. Not to Martinez, not to the prosecutor, not to the system that had tried to drown her. She drew in a slow breath and began. I was silent when my friend was cheated. Her voice carried into every corner, clear and deliberate. The words were not for sympathy. They were confession. I was silent when numbers replaced faces. The gallery stilled further. Even reporters, pens ready, hesitated to write, afraid to break the rhythm. I will not be silent now. Her eyes lifted, gaze steady, locking on the jury, then sweeping across the gallery. The anaphora struck like drum beats. 3 confessions. 3 refusals. Martinez shifted uneasily, his body jerking as though each line struck him physically. His lips parted, but no sound came. Clara's tone sharpened. You sold lies. You sold fear. You sold silence. Each repetition grew sharper, louder, forcing the gallery to feel the weight of his crimes not as abstract evidence, but as lived consequence. Today, she said, voice cutting clean, none of them will save you. The final line landed like a verdict, before the verdict. The jury's eyes widened. A man in the back exhaled so loudly, it echoed. Clara straightened the papers in front of her, but she didn't need them anymore. Everything essential had already been spoken. She turned to the bench, the gavel still in the judge's hand, suspended between authority and inertia. On the charges of federal fraud, wire fraud, and abuse of authority, This court finds Officer Miguel Martinez guilty. The word guilty seemed to ripple in slow motion. It left her lips and traveled across the room, sinking into every ear, every heart. The gavel rose. For 1 second, the room braced for the sharp crack it had heard countless times before. But when the gavel fell, the sound stretched slow motion, elongated, echoing into eternity. Not a bang, a wave, a resonance that would not be forgotten. The echo faded into silence. Martinez collapsed into his chair. The fury that had animated him was gone. His eyes stared blankly ahead, unfocused, emptied. His shoulders slumped. The once unshakable officer now looked like a husk, hollowed out by truth. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras flashed, but none of it could match the weight of the moment. A man who had sold painted gravel as magic, who had hidden behind a badge, who had silenced dozens, finally silenced by justice. Clara stepped forward, voice steady. "Sentencing will follow," she said, though the formality felt secondary to what had just been declared. Clear. God is not a hustle. Abuse is not service. Silence is not safety. She let her gaze linger on Martinez. You believed power was noise. Today you learned power is proof. He blinked once, slow, but offered no reply. His eyes were glassy, his face pale. Clara turned back to the courtroom, her voice softening, not losing force but gaining gravity. I once thought justice was the sound of a gavel. I thought it was the echo of wood on wood, sharp and final. But I have learned otherwise. Her words slowed. Careful. Crafted. Justice is not the gavel that strikes. It's the heart that no longer trembles. The line fell into the silence like scripture. Daniel, the clerk, wrote it down word for word, his pen trembling slightly. He underlined it twice, then sat back, staring at the sentence as though he knew it would be quoted long after today. The gallery was still, reverent. A woman clutched her purse to her chest. A man bowed his head. The room was not erupting with applause or noise. It was holding its breath, honoring the line as though applause would cheapen it. Clara folded her papers, slid them back into her briefcase, and rested her hand on the robe's trim. The gold thread caught the light, faint but steady. She looked at the jury once more, at the gallery, at the cameras. Her eyes did not seek validation. They delivered responsibility. You've seen what happens when silence rules. You've seen what happens when numbers replace names. Today you've seen what happens when proof finally speaks. Do not forget. The cameras zoomed in, focusing on her face, capturing the lines that would become sound bites, headlines, memories. Martinez was led away, his wrists shackled, his shoulders slumped. He did not resist. His eyes were empty. The gallery watched in silence, some with grim satisfaction, others with quiet sorrow. But all knew they had witnessed not only a verdict against a man, but a verdict against a system that had allowed him to thrive. Clara remained at the bench a moment longer, her fingers brushing against the wood. She closed her eyes briefly, hearing the slow-motion echo of the gavel one more time in her mind. Not as noise, as transformation. Then she opened her eyes, straightened her robe, and stepped down. The trial was not just concluded. It was rewritten. The trial had ended, but its echoes were only beginning. Miguel Martinez no longer swaggered through the courthouse halls. His badge was stripped, his uniform folded and stored in an evidence locker. Shackles rattled against his wrists as marshals escorted him out the back door, a man who once barked orders now stumbling like a shadow. Papers moved fast. By morning, a headline blazed across every newsstand in bold type, from rocks to ruins. Off R-A-U-D. Officer, jailed. The photo beneath it showed Martinez, head bowed, his once polished shoes scuffed, his eyes hollow. A story that had begun with painted gravel now ended with bars and concrete. But the aftermath was not just his. Within weeks, the Department of Justice announced federal oversight of the precinct. The Civil Rights Division confirmed what Clara had laid bare. Systemic misconduct, decades of ignored complaints, millions spent in secret settlements. The Special Investigations Unit. Martinez had once lorded over was dissolved. Its files were reopened, its officers reassigned or suspended, pending review. For the first time in decades, accountability had a foothold. At the press conference, the DOJ official spoke with uncharacteristic bluntness. This case proves silence is not a defense. We are implementing a consent decree to ensure oversight, transparency, and reform. The community deserves no less. Cameras flashed, microphones crowded, but every story written that day carried one name above all others. Judge Clara Whitmore. Not all consequences were written in legal language. Some were written in letters. Weeks later, Clara received an envelope with handwriting she recognized. Yeah, Daniel, the young clerk. Inside was a page filled with nervous script. You showed me silence isn't safety, it read. You showed me that recording the truth isn't enough if no one dares to speak it. I will not be silent again. I've applied to law school. I want to fight with words, the way you did. Thank you. Clara held the letter in her hands for a long time, the paper trembling slightly between her fingers. She thought of the pen Daniel had dropped that day, of the way his silence had mirrored her own younger self. She thought of how cycles of silence break only when someone dares to stand. A small smile touched her lips. One afternoon, outside the courthouse, a man waited. He was lean, mid-20s, carrying a folder worn at the edges. His eyes carried years older than his age. Clara recognized him, David Nguyen, the young man whose wrongful conviction she had revealed during testimony. He stepped forward, extended his hand. His grip was firm, but it trembled. Your fight gave me back my name, he said simply. Clara met his gaze. It was always yours. The system just tried to erase it. David's eyes glistened. He nodded once, holding her hand a second longer before releasing it. He walked away taller than he had arrived. The city, too, carried the scars and the healing. Some officers retired quietly. Others began training under the DOJ monitors, learning procedures that valued transparency over silence. Citizens once fearful of filing complaints began to step forward, their voices no longer brushed aside. And the courthouse itself bore a new mark. Months later, a small crowd gathered on its marble steps for a dedication ceremony. Officials, citizens, reporters, all stood before a bronze plaque draped in cloth. Daniel was there, now in a suit, carrying casebooks instead of pens. He took the podium briefly, his voice steadier than Clara remembered. I won't be silent again, he told the crowd. Not after today. Not after what I saw. Proof matters. Words matter. You have to speak them. He stepped aside, and Clara was asked to unveil the plaque. She pulled the cloth gently, revealing the engraving. 1010 of you. Fresh Moore Hall. In proof we trust. Gasps rose. Then applause. The letters gleamed in the sunlight, not ostentatious but resolute, a promise carved into metal. Clara stood silently before it, robe folded in her arms rather than on her shoulders. Her eyes traced each letter. Proof. Trust. Not just words, but a creed. Reporters crowded, eager for her reaction. But she spoke softly, almost to herself. This isn't about me. It's about all the voices that were ignored. All the lives nearly erased. Rafe brought them back. Yet the crowd heard her anyway. And her words became tomorrow's headline. In the weeks that followed, stories multiplied. A mother once dismissed with her son's death certificate finally had her complaint reopened. A family who had settled in silence now spoke publicly, their grief finally named. A clerk who had once been afraid now studied late into the night, preparing for the law he once only recorded. And Clara? She returned to her bench. Yeah, cases came and went, small, some seismic. But every time she lifted her gavel, she remembered. Justice was not in the strike. It was in the steadying of hearts once trembling. When she walked past the plaque on the courthouse steps, she never paused for long. But sometimes, when sunlight caught the bronze just right, she whispered words only she could hear. Unsue? From rocks to ruins. From silence to proof. And she carried the burden gladly. The trial was over. The sentence had been read. The fraudster stripped of his badge, his pride, and his lies. The gallery had dispersed, murmurs fading into the marble corridors. But the cameras remained. The lens turned toward her. Clara Whitmore. Federal judge. Survivor of deceit? Arbiter of truth. She stood not behind the bench now, but in front of the camera, robe folded at her side, as if to strip away all pretense of distance. This wasn't the judge speaking from her chair. This was the woman speaking from her scars. The camera operator whispered, "We're live." The lens zoomed in, steady, unblinking. First a close-up, then closer, until her eyes filled the frame. The world could see nothing but the steel in her gaze. Clara didn't look away. She didn't glance at notes. She didn't rehearse. She spoke. Actions have consequences. The words landed heavy, as though she were chiseling them into stone. "We," she drew in a breath. "Yep." Today, those lies bought justice. She let the silence after the line breathe, the weight of it pressing through the lens into every living room, every phone screen, every watching heart. Then she leaned slightly forward, the robe's gold trim catching faint light, her voice softening but cutting deeper. "He sold lies as magic. I bought them, but today, those lies bought justice." Her tone wasn't anger now. It was admission, vulnerable, personal, undeniable. The camera zoomed tighter, catching the faint reflection of the studio light in her pupils. Her voice lowered, but the words carried more force than any shout. "If you've ever been silenced," she said, "don't stay quiet. Share this story, because silence won't keep you safe. Proof will." Her eyes didn't blink. The weight of her gaze wasn't just a stare. It was a challenge. The frame froze for a second in the viewer's imagination. A still image that could be clipped, reposted, quoted. The kind of sentence that doesn't just end a story. It travels. Clara exhaled once, then continued. "Silence feeds lies. Silence lets frauds become heroes. Silence lets painted gravel pass as treasure. And silence is what men like him count on. They gamble that you'll stay quiet. They bet that fear will keep you still. And for too long, they've been right." Her hand touched the folded robe at her side. She didn't lift it, didn't put it back on. She let it sit there, a symbol of power resting in cloth rather than action. "I wore this robe today. But this robe isn't justice. Justice is not fabric. It's not the gavel that strikes. It's not the seal on the wall. Justice is when hearts stop trembling in fear. Justice is when silence breaks into proof." The words hit harder than the verdict itself. She leaned even closer. The lens caught every contour of her face, the faint lines of exhaustion, the resolve etched deeper than any scar. "I don't ask you to believe me. I ask you to remember me. Remember this case. Remember that lies dressed as miracles are still lies. Remember that silence will never keep you safe. Proof will." The camera pulled back slightly, framing her shoulders, her presence filling the screen. Clara looked down for a moment, then lifted her gaze one final time. It wasn't the gaze of a victim. It wasn't even the gaze of a judge. It was the gaze of someone who had carried silence, broken it, and now passed the burden on. "If you've ever been silenced," she repeated, her voice now resolute, "don't stay quiet. Share this story. Because silence won't keep you safe. Proof will." She stepped back, just slightly, enough for the frame to catch her whole figure. The screen faded to black. Then words appeared, white on black, echoing her voice. "Actiims have consequences. Silence won't keep you safe. Proof will." The sound of a slow, resonant gavel strike lingered, not sharp, not final, but steady, like a heartbeat.